When Germany went to war in 1939, the Luftwaffe wanted to present an image of modern warfare. A new line of modern bombers, dive bombers and aircraft ushered in the so-called Blitzkrieg legend. But behind all of that, there were a lot of artifacts left over from that rapid industrial growth and those massive jumps in aeronautical developments. And one of them was still flying, the Henschel 123. Welcome back to the Luftwaffe at War. In this video I will explore the story of the Henschel 123, but instead of just talking about the plane and its development, I want to broaden our perspective as well. In recent years, the underdog reputation of the 123 has caused a rise in associated myths, especially the question as to whether the Germans wanted to put this aircraft back into production in the 1940s has seen some debate, and I will get in on that. Now, this episode is of course part of my Growing the Luftwaffe at War series, which you can find linked in the description below, and as a Patreon supporter or a channel member, you also have early access to all the episodes. Talking of other episodes, my research including all archive trips are supported by patrons and channel members. Supporters get upcoming episodes early, can vote on topics and have priority access to Q&As. And you can get these bonuses too by signing up on patreon.com/milAvHistory or via YouTube memberships on Military Aviation History. Thanks to Jessica, Philip and Tekaplan Kali who recently signed up. As I chat about the Henschel 123, I want to address one very important subject: sourcing. The aircraft's overall technical and developmental aspects are of course known, and its operational history can be tracked from Spain to the Soviet Union. But there is no depth. Books on the Henschel 123, of which there aren't that many to start with, tend to talk a lot around the Henschel 123 rather than on and off it. And a lot of the information has a heavy dose of anecdotalism and a narrative flair that makes my historian spider senses tingle. My own research in archives also contributes to this unease, as finding any detailed information about the Henschel 123 and its operations is rare. So as I go into this video, we must keep in mind that information is sparse. As always, I will do my best to ignore anecdotal parts that I cannot find any substance for. Where I mention them or I have to because of limited sources, I will let you know. And beyond that, I will also go into an analysis of some of the more romanticized parts of the Henschel 123, because, oh boy, is this plane taken out of context sometimes. Now, let's get to it. The origin of the Henschel 123 is an unlikely one. This will sound strange to you if you know about the First World War and the increasing importance the Imperial German Army had put on close air support back then. At the end of the First World War, Germany fielded what is arguably the first purpose-built attacker aircraft, the Junkers J-1. But then fast forward about, 20-25 years into the early 1930s, now little of this enthusiasm for close air support remains. I spoke about this in my Luftwaffe Doctrine episode, and thus I won't repeat that part of the story here. To sum it up, the Luftwaffe did not encourage an investment into a pure close air support platform, instead choosing to experiment with more multi-role aircraft, like the Kampfzerstörer or the Schnellbomber concepts. One could thus argue that the Henschel 123 was never meant to be. So we have the unlikely origin point number 1. Now let's go to the next reason. The 123 started as a venture by Henschel to develop a dive-bombing capable aircraft. When the Reichsair Ministry finally sees it, it says 9. And for those that do not speak the Kraut, 9 means no. The Air Ministry understood the trajectory of technological development and quickly changed its specifications accordingly. It wanted an all-metal, monoplane, multi-crew dive bomber, designed to operate at high altitudes with an extended dive. The 123 was none of those things. Well, it was almost all metal. Parts of the wings were still canvas covered until the later B model. So, the 123 was neither particularly wanted nor suited to the demands of the Air Ministry. Moving on to unlikely reason number 3. It was built by an unlikely candidate. the Henschel Flugzeugwerke AG, a company that didn't even exist in the early 1930s. Now, Henschel & Sohn AG was a household name at the time. It was founded in 1848 and it became one of those 19th century industrial powerhouses on the backs of rapid industrial growth. It specialized in locomotives, before then moving on to trucks and tooling machinery. Even some household goods were produced by Henschel & Sohn AG. But aircraft? Well, aircraft had not been on the books yet. That changed in 1931, when Henschel saw the struggling aircraft company industry in Germany, and having a surprising amount of cash for the time, it decides to go shopping. First Junkers, then Arado, then Albatros, then Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, later Messerschmitt, and then Rohrbach. Except that Henschel actually fails to close a single of these deals. So in March 1933, with a hefty dose of political backing by the new Nazi party in power, it founded Henschel Flugzeugwerke AG and settled in Berlin-Schönefeld in 1934. Berlin-Schönefeld. Do those words ring any bell to you? Why, yes, you are absolutely correct. This is exactly the location where Berlin's new old airport is now, Berlin-Brandenburg. In fact, as far as I can tell, parts of the Henschel buildings still stand and actually set the foundations for the airport's administration, staff canteen, and the firefighting building. And yes, I mean today's airport. To build a new factory plus airport in the 1930s, this required a massive investment. The owner of the land that was to be used wanted 2.5 million Reichsmark for it, and he would simply not budge. So the Nazi party did what it always did, and it came in swinging. First up, it just started building a factory with an airport, no permissions asked. And then within a year, the factory was finished, complete with a new railroad track, housing, factory halls, and an independent electricity supply that would have been enough for a city of about 40,000 people. Eventually, this factory alone employed more than 17,000 workers, and, well, because it's the Luftwaffe, we can assume that about 50% of those were forced laborers by 1945. Now remember this in broad terms. I will refer to this industrial buildup again by the end of the video because it's actually important when we think about the 1, 2, 3 and its more popular memory. But what about the owner of the land, you may now ask? Well, what owner? I reply. Remember, this is the Nazi party we are talking about. Hitler and Goering simply signed the decree and, here the sources disagree a bit, they either forced a sale or expropriated the owner. With 2 signatures, the land belonged to Henschel Flugzeugwerke AG. End of. And all things considered, the owner may have gotten off lightly here, but I don't know actually what happened to them later on. Henschel, having little success with its first designs, soon started building aircraft on license. First the Dornier 23s, then Dornier 17s and Ju-88s and 188s. But it would also have some success down the line. Look at the close recce aircraft, the Henschel 126, and the later attacker, the Henschel 129, which the internet of course seems to have dubbed the Panzerquacker. And yes, of course we also have the Henschel 123. So from building locomotives to aircraft, not the wildest origin story, but a bit unlikely nonetheless, I would argue, given that Henschel had to start from scratch. Oh, and by the way, the fact that Henschel knew how to build locomotives was part of the reason why they got the Henschel 129 contract. More about that in another video. But then let me go to the final reason why the Henschel 123 was such an unlikely bird. By the time the 123 was accepted and fielded, so this is 1935 to 1936, it was already clear that it would be out of date very quickly. This was a common phenomenon for aircraft at the time. Anything developed and fielded between, say, well, roughly speaking, 1933 to 1937, well, that tended to have a lifespan of a flash in a pan. I believe that's the saying. Anyway, aeronautical developments were so fast in the 1930s that a plane coming out on Tuesday may very well have been out of date by Thursday, replaced by a more powerful and capable machine. So the 123 was not what the Luftwaffe wanted, nor did it particularly impress, nor did it look like it would be around for long. So why was it adopted? That is a good question. From my reading, it looks like this was done for 2 reasons. It was available, and it was of a better quality than potential competitors like the Fiesler 98. As a stopgap, it could replace the first generation of new military biplanes with a bit of an upgrade and also contribute to Henschel getting some experience and contracts under their belt. And it was, simply put, the best candidate for a limited production run as the Luftwaffe builds up its numbers and moves on to more modern, but also more expensive and complex aircraft. And talking about production runs, about 230 to 250 123s were built. So let's look at the Henschel 123 in some more detail. This was a single crew all-metal biplane, although parts of the wings were still covered in fabric in the A model. Now the 123 was powered by a radial engine, the BMW 132. Now that's easy to remember. This engine gave it a solid performance for a biplane, and its range was okay-ish for a plane of its type, but this could actually be extended by a centerline external fuel tank. Now it was armed with 2 fixed machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller, and the initial bomb load was light, 2 50-kilogram bombs on each lower wing. Experiments were then conducted with an internal bomb load of vertically mounted 10-kilogram bomblets. That was not adopted, but the external fuel tank was also swappable for a single 500-kilogram bomb or a 250-kilogram bomb if the wing bombs are also carried. For a biplane, this was a very respectable bomb load for the time. And for pilot protection, there was also armor and a firewall. But the sources disagree if this was already mounted during development or much later. Now, let's go over its operational history. This is where things get difficult. And I don't want to be negative here, but I think as historians and history fans, we should really evaluate what we know and what we think we know. I want to tell you all about the Henschel 123's operations in Spain, Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, or even the Balkans. But details in the literature are very sparse. All we know is the broad strokes, and sometimes with unsupported statements. In fact, many of the books that you can consult on this aircraft don't have any foot or endnotes, and that annoys me to no end. But it is likely not the author's fault, but a publisher decision. Anyway, one thing I noticed when reading up on the Henschel 123 in preparation for this video is that, well, the books actually don't give that many examples of close air support, or CAS in short. There are basically sort of 4 stories that keep on getting highlighted. First, that the Henschel 123 replaces the Heinkel 51 in Spain as a ground attacker and seems to do well. In Poland, its first attack on the border town of Panki is regarded as the first close air support mission of the war. And then in France, the 123 helps stop a counterattack at Cambrai. And in the Soviet Union, well, there's some very anecdotal stuff about stopping a Soviet tank column at Vitebsk, but that's basically it. The rest is often narrative fluff over a page or 2, and that's great if you like a war story, but not if you want to crystallize clear learnings on, about, and from the Henschel 123. And that is what I want, and I think that's also what you want. I did find one interesting file in the German military archive that exactly demonstrates this problem while giving some details. It is a report written in 1953, so after the war, on the action of the 21st of May 1940 at Cambrai. It was commissioned by the Allies post-war when they started studying how the Wehrmacht fought and so on, and this account is about 4 pages long. Having read it, it checks out almost one-to-one with many of the accounts in books that you can read about this action at Cambrai, and may be the main source for any historian who has actually written on this action before. And I say this not to disparage these authors, but to showcase the complexity of historical research on this aircraft. This report, which has a very narrative flair and lots of superfluous adjectives in my mind, but whatever, it was written in 1953 and it may be our only, or at least our main source for this action that happened in 1940. So what happened according to this file? Well, on the 21st of May 1940, the airbase of Cambrai had already become a forward airbase for Zweite Gruppe Schlacht of Lehrgeschwader 2, flying the Henschel 123. Early in the morning, a French armored and motorized column was spotted advancing towards Cambrai. This attack risked not just taking the airfield, but more critically cutting off the German supply lines from the rear to the forward positions at the channel. And no German army unit was available to pose a serious threat until reinforcements from the Zweite Armeekorps could arrive. As the report goes, the commander of the Henschel 123s takes off, either alone or in a small formation, that's a bit unclear, and then goes on an armed reconnaissance flight. Spotting the French tanks, he attacks and then orders rolling sorties against the French, who are seemingly sort of within 5-minute distance from the airfield, flying distance that is. Apparently he ordered that the motorized trucks are to be a priority, not the tanks. Some of the books refer more to attacks against tanks. I don't know what's going on here. I couldn't verify that. Meanwhile, the airfield flak, which based on one of the books I have also included some 88mm guns, also starts firing at the French, who then eventually divert their assault before being contained by German reinforcements. Now, this is one of those early examples of how air can, if used properly, shape the ground war at the forward line of troops. As a quick reaction, the Henschel 123 allowed the French attack to be delayed and attrited, before reinforcements then could arrive to beat back the counterattack, and it clearly foreshadows also some of those later Luftwaffe operations on the Eastern Front. You can see the similarities there. Beyond this example, however, I find it interesting that a large number of Henschel 123 missions that are referenced in the literature actually don't really fall inside what is close air support. Even this example in France is tenuous, I would say, since I don't find any evidence of clear army-air coordination, which would have included targeting requests and radio communication. Sure, this is a conceptual debate, but it is important because if as historians we make the argument that the 123 was the only German close air support aircraft available at the time, and then we do not or cannot provide any examples of army-air cooperation at the forward line of troops, you can start seeing the problem. Maybe this aircraft was used slightly differently. It reminds me of the stories with the A-10 Thunderbolt II, right? Being a tank killer in the Gulf War. But given the data we have, it actually did not destroy that many tanks compared to other aircraft. There's some aircraft that did far better. But just because its origin was to be a tank killer, that's the story behind the A-10, right? We assume it kills tanks. The Henschel 123 is specified as a close air support aircraft, so it follows that it must have done that all the time. But it is only once we find the data that we can actually definitively say that. But let's move on. How do I rate the Henschel 123 and what is its true significance in my mind? On the whole, the Henschel 123 was a fine light attacker biplane for the 1930s. I actually like the look of it and I understand the underdog appeal. But having read about it and having read about the Luftwaffe and having conducted a lot of research in this area, I really warn against overly romanticizing this aircraft. For a plane of its type, the 123, yes, it carried a respectable bomb load, and its slow speed and low altitude operations that provides the Luftwaffe with a niche capability. And its rough field capability as well appears useful. It allowed the 123 to be based on unprepared fields closer to the front line. Well, so was the Ju-87 Stuka and the Focke-Wulf 190 in the end. But yes, a simpler plane with a lighter basing footprint can definitely have advantages. There is in fact another anecdote here. Apparently to test if a 123 could operate from a field, the squadron would get a small car and drive it full speed over said field. And if it wasn't, open quote, too bumpy at 50 kilometers an hour, end quote, then the aircrafts could be based there. As you can see, the Germans are always very scientific in everything they do. Honestly, I can see this being done. In fact, I think it was done. Although I also think that it says more about the car's suspension than a plane's basic requirements. But anyway, the 123 had niche merits in the early war period. However, we must consider the context. When Germany launches its attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, it had about 150 Henschel 123s on its books. By December of 1942, so a year and a half later, it had 110 left. Okay, so that's about 40 total losses in 1.5 years. But then again, it was only using this aircraft in basically a Staffel and a half, so only about 20 of them were really operational at any point in time. That's already a high number. So 40 losses in 1.5 years, that makes sense because that aircraft wasn't used that much, and something else that I will refer to soon. And it really doesn't sound bad, 40 losses, right? And it's one of those numbers I often see cited in support of the 123. But now get this, by March 1943, so 3 months later than December 1942, Germany is down now from 110 to 30 Henschel 123. Yes, 30 aircraft are left. That means that before Stalingrad, Germany lost about 2 Henschels a month on the Eastern Front. And then in the 3 following months, Germany loses about 80 aircraft. That's 26 Henschels a month. Now the reason for this is important. At the start of the war, generally, Germany had the ability to generate tactical, if not operational level air superiority over the critical locations. The Henschel 123 benefited from this. And also, countries like Poland and France had minimal AA defenses at the front lines. I talked about this in my previous episodes. For the first 2 years, the Soviet Union also didn't challenge the air domain too much. It just couldn't. The Battle of Stalingrad is typically a turning point here. We're starting to see a rebounding Soviet Air Force and also a strengthening Soviet ground defense. And the Soviets here are back in action. It's not a complete reversal in the air, but you can start seeing the result on the Luftwaffe side with rising losses. And next to a very challenging winter, I think this renewed strength hits the Henschel 123 quite hard. And this is why I'm critical when people argue that the Henschel 123 was rugged and not as vulnerable to enemy fire, or was better for cold weather operations. On the former argument, sure, due to the radial engine, it had no vulnerable water cooling requirements, for example, compared to the 109. But everything is survivable if nothing shoots at it, or if its missions are in areas that are more permissible. But remember, this is an aircraft with a top speed of about 300 kilometers an hour, operating at very low altitudes. Any AA gunner that sees this aircraft in its range will lick their lips and think, showtime. And then there are the cold weather operations around Stalingrad, where apparently the 123 was excelling at. Those stories about being able to fly when other more modern planes didn't. Okay, let's think about this. Yes, that winter was rough on the Luftwaffe, like really rough. And maybe the 123 had a better availability ratio during this time. I have yet to see evidence of that, but let's go with that argument. However, look at the 123. It has an open cockpit, and it only has a very rudimentary heating system for the flight suit. To suggest that this keep it simple stupid aircraft was suitable for flying temperatures that were at the time like minus 20 degrees Celsius, I think we need to let that go. Hang on, what's that in American? Minus 20 Celsius is minus 4 height Fahrenheit or something like that. So yeah, if you're American, you can also now let that go. Now, that is not to say that the Henschel 123 didn't have any significance. I actually do think that there is a significance behind this aircraft, just not what is often suggested in these conversations. Let me explain. There is a more important aspect to discuss than these tactical level evaluations we constantly run into. We must look at the force level. The 123 provided a small cadre, a core of pilots that could test and practice close air support. And when I say small, I mean small. Initially, this was 2 Schlachtfliegergruppen for the takeover of the Sudetenland in 1938, and then later on the whole of Czechoslovakia in 1939, right? This then gets rebranded into the Zweite Gruppe Schlacht of Lehrgeschwader 2 for Poland, and at this point, Germany has 40 Henschel 123s in operational use. Of a Luftwaffe fleet that numbers 3,650 operational aircraft for the invasion of Poland. So the Henschel 123s, they're like 1% of the force. By the way, this is one of those awesome statistics to use when people on the internet tell you that the Germans were supposedly blitzkrieg awesome close air support visionaries. 1% of their force in Poland is flying a close air support aircraft, and it is less than 1% in France. And the jury is still out if the Henschel 123 really did a lot of CAS. Again, I'll talk about that in just a moment. So this Gruppe, you can say, may allow for an early refinement of close air support in operational conditions in Poland and France. Again, we don't have that much evidence on CAS, but I think we can at least assume that it provided a nucleus of experience. You know, how do you base and equip a Schlachtgeschwader? What bombs are best used against what targets? How do you communicate with the army on the operational and tactical level? What sort of information is required? What sort of radio communication is needed? All of this is valuable data and useful to the Luftwaffe and Heer, beyond what is already gathered by the 8th Fliegerkorps that does a lot of the more Army-Air cooperation, but watch my video on that. It would truly be interesting to see to what extent this influenced the emergent Schlachtgeschwader of 1942. After all, the Henschel 123 were in the only designated Luftwaffe Schlachtgruppe from 1939 to 1940. As far as I can tell, however, there is absolutely no detailed evaluation available on this yet. So what sort of experiences were learned with this aircraft and how this was then transported into the Luftwaffe and applied by the Luftwaffe. So as we don't have that, let me give you my preliminary analysis based on my archival research and the literature. Now, the Henschel 123 kept close air support alive in the Luftwaffe, but it basically was on life support. This was a very low level operations, right? As the value of close air support is then recognized following Poland and France, 2 of the 3 Henschel 123 Staffern were equipped with a modified fighter bomber Bf-109E. While this means that there is now only a single dedicated 123 Staffel, normally this means about 9 to 12 planes, it also shows that this re-equipment is starting to take place. Now 20 Bf-109E fighter bombers is a modest risk-free investment for the time. However, it demonstrates that renewed consideration of close air support, something that the experience with the 123 and Fliegerkorps, the 8. Fliegerkorps as a whole, likely facilitated. And I actually think that the experiences of 8. Fliegerkorps may be more important here than the experiences of the 123, but that's just on the side. Now these planes and the pilots, as far as I would argue, would likely be well placed to provide the necessary insight to make this transition from the 123 to the fighter bomber 109s possible and fairly smooth. This was a 3-month training course in January to April 1942. However, it was not until January 1942 that the Luftwaffe actually forms a dedicated Schlachtgeschwader for close air support. This was not because someone saw a few dinky biplanes dropping bombs from 50 meters and thought, well, that's a good idea. Instead, there was a real operational and tactical need for firepower at the front lines, especially to contain the increasingly armored, mechanized and motorized Soviet formations. By this point, Germany uses a wild mix of Bf-109E fighter bombers, early 129s, Ju-87s, Bf-110s, and of course a growing force of Focke-Wulf 190s for close air support. So the 123 really isn't that important anymore. The second thing I would say about the Henschel 123 is that it may have been a missed opportunity for the Germans, which is a good thing, mind you. But let me explain. With hindsight and of course the hefty caution of let's not get suckered into these what-if scenarios, the Henschel 123 might have been a good aircraft for anti-partisan warfare on the Eastern Front and in the Balkans. Why do I say that? Well, you have the pilots trained to fly low at a reasonable speed, which made identification of movements on the ground helpful. Pilots may also already know how to work in conjunction with infantry and, well, partisans. Partisans don't really have weapons against aircraft. And even if they did, they'd think twice, if not thrice, before opening up and giving away their position. The Henschel 123 bomb load is good enough against such soft targets, and it's not really a massive resource investment in terms of fuel and basing to put these somewhere in the area. Basically, it's the equivalent of a modern Reaper or Bayraktar drone. It's very cost effective in a permissive environment. And from what I read about the Henschel 123 use in hilly terrain, like in the Spanish Civil War, and as a frontline night raider then later on in 1944, this may have been able to work. Also, you know those fuel extenders the Germans used and also the Allies used in hilly and swampy terrain? Well, from what I learned recently, the Germans may have gotten this idea from the Spanish. Apparently in Spain this was called the Santiago Mendi, just like the Germans called it the Nordstäbe after the supposed inventor. And apparently the 123s were already using those in the Spanish Civil War. But if you are Spanish and know more, please let me know in the comments. But yeah, before I go down another rabbit hole, I have one final point to make here about the 123. And that is the story that this aircraft was supposed to return into production in the 1940s. Now this didn't happen. But the story goes that some people wanted to have this happen to replace the slowly attriting force on the Eastern Front. Now, Wolfram von Richthofen is sometimes quoted in saying this. You know, anecdotally, he is supposed to have said that if he had like 1,000 Henschel 123s on the Eastern Front, he could have turned the tide in the air. Okay, where to start? These sort of anecdotal statements pop up every now and then. I still don't know where it comes from specifically, mind you. And sometimes these are put in context and usually they're taken completely out of context. Now, I don't know, as I said, the context of this one, and I already told you about the staggering losses of the Henschel 123 force once the Soviet Union rebounded. Anyway, I think the importance of this "let's put the Henschel 123 back into production" is completely overstated. It is a story that is kept alive by our predisposition of liking the underdog, especially with the Germans and their propensity to over-engineer the story that this simple biplane somehow is the thing they absolutely must have. It's a story that sells itself. I think here it is worthwhile to remember that one of the biggest problems the Luftwaffe had was a lack of industrial capacity that broadly came in three elements: resources, production space, and workers. Production, especially of engines, had to be continuously revised because of this, in order to permit the Luftwaffe to field the required aircraft with the limited resources it had. The 123, I remind you, used the BMW 132, but this engine was also used in the tri-motor Ju-52. A single of these air transporters was vastly more important to the German war effort than even 3 Henschel 123s, I would argue. Just remember the absurd 50% losses the Ju-52 fleet suffers in 1940. Keep an eye out on that episode. This was a force that the Germans never recovered, which bites them again and again across the war. Not just at Stalingrad and in Tunisia, but across the war. The value of siphoning off engines for the 123 would have only exacerbated the big problems the Germans had. On the one hand, not enough Ju-52s, and on the other hand, on the production level really, producing way too many different airplanes in too few locations. Germany perpetually lacked industrial space to build aircraft. For this you need buildings, workers, existing road and rail infrastructure, electricity, water and an airport. And although there was a massive build-up in the 1930s, just think about, for example, that Junkers-Dessau triangle and what I told you earlier about Henschel's own factory, in fact, in Berlin-Schönefeld. I told you we would go full circle here. Across the war, it was never enough, leading Luftwaffe to make some drastic choices to get more square meters to build aircraft. For example, you know the old Tempelhof airport in Berlin? That massive propaganda project with its main building shaped after an eagle's wing? Yes, that became a factory during the war, building Ju-87s and Ju-88s, for example. Giving any of this space to the Henschel 123 at the cost of, I don't know, a Focke-Wulf 190? Well, it's not a rational choice in my mind. But maybe you think differently, at which point, do please let me know in the comments. Oh, and I forgot to mention, in 1937, Henschel actually bought 12 aircraft back from the Luftwaffe to sell to Portugal, but that didn't happen, so they were sold to China for 2 million Reichsmark. Apparently, at some point, these aircraft attacked the Japanese destroyers and then damaged it, then ended up as training aircraft. As always with this aircraft, details are very sparse, so take this with a grain of salt. And yes, that's me done on the Henschel 123.
Join me next time on The Luftwaffe at War as we dive deeper into the Luftwaffe's operations, aircraft and thinking during World War II. The show is written and produced by me, Christoph Bergs, and if you want to get a hold of future episodes early, vote on topics and get priority access to Q&As, become a supporter of The Luftwaffe at War at patreon.com/milavhistory or via YouTube memberships on military aviation history. A big thank you goes to all the supporters for making this possible. As always, thank you for joining me today and have a great day and see you in the sky.